Hi, everybody, and welcome to Shannon Q. I'm really excited today. We're going to have an awesome conversation. I'm going to apologize for my voice and the chance that I'm probably going to be coughing because I do have a bit of a cold, but that's not going to stop me because I'm really excited about this conversation. Today, I have Mike here from Inspiring Philosophy, who I encountered while I was moderating a debate on the Modern Day Debate channel, and him and I kind of hijacked that debate and then also hijacked the after show, having a conversation about consciousness and the soul, and we thought that it was so interesting and there was so much depth there that it merited us having a conversation one-on-one without all those interruptions of other people trying to talk about what we were there to talk about to begin with. so I invited him on here and he was kind enough to agree to join me. So before we get into it, I'm going to give you an opportunity to introduce yourself. And also, I just wanted to say thank you for joining me. I appreciate it. So Mike, tell everybody who you are and where they can find you.
Yeah, sure. Yeah. Thanks for having me on. I love talking about this kind of stuff. So my channel is Inspiring Philosophy. I'm sure a lot of people already know. I'll just say I'm a Christian apologist, and but I'm a little different because I would call myself like an idealist in terms of philosophy of mind. So I'm not a traditional William Lane Craig substance dualist. So that's the kind of path I take, and I do some videos on that as well as plenty of other topics.
Okay, cool. So go subscribe to his channel. His link is in the description, as well as at least two of the articles I found that he and I have been exchanging back and forth over the course of the last little while that may become relevant in the conversation. And even if they don't get brought up, they're really interesting articles. I'd encourage you to go read them. They're down in the description. So we're going to start out. I just wanted to get your perspective, Mike, on exactly what your idea of the soul is. And maybe you can kind of touch a little bit on what it means to be, did you say an idealist?
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Yeah.
Do you think those two marry well together and that you could get into that a little bit? We can go from there.
Yeah. I'll define all the terms here. So if you think of it in very simplistic terms, just materialism, physicalism is just the idea that all that exists is matter. And there's various views within that area, like limited materialism, property dualism, et cetera, et cetera. And it's just the idea the brain somehow creates consciousness, or maybe it's just an illusion, something of that. But basically everything is matter. Then you get substance dualist, and you basically have two substances, mind and matter, and there's sort of some sort of interaction going on there. The idealist says, no, everything is mind, and matter would be some sort of emergent property of mind. So it's like the exact opposite of physicalism in that instead of matter being the grounding of mental, it's mental that's the grounding of matter. So it's a reverse. And you can think of people like Schopenhauer, Bishop Berkeley. These are idealists, famous philosophers in that kind of realm. In terms of like definitions, yeah, it's good to define terms because like when I define soul, it's probably different than how some other people define soul. So, I mean, and I've been guilty of this in the past of using the word soul in various meanings. It's a kind of just a generalized term people throw around. So what I've come to define soul is just, it's not so much the immaterial stuff in that sense.
Mm-hmm.
The way I kind of read soul in like the New Testament is it's basically a combination of your personality, your thoughts, dreams, emotions, feelings, goals, all of these mental information floating around in your head, so to speak. That's kind of what I think Paul means when he talks about the soul. Then there's something I would say is the mind, which is sort of behind the soul. The mind, I would say, is the conscious I, the you, who you are, the self-aware agent. And every mind then, therefore, has a soul that they sort of grow and develop throughout life. So a lot of people use these terms interchangeably to mean the same thing. Just for the purpose of this talk, I just want to clarify these two terms, what I mean. So in that sense, we all agree we have a soul in that sense, because we all agree we have a personality, we all have thoughts, emotions. The question then it becomes is, what is the soul and what is the mind, the conscious self? Is that emergent from the brain? Is it something fundamental, irreducible? Is the soul contingent on the mind? Does the soul, the information of the brain, sort of create the conscious I and that kind of self? So that's just some basic terminology to get out of the way, I'd say.
Okay, so but before we get started, I'll do the same favor. So my perception of it is, and here with the one stipulation that this is something that's of great interest to me, and I have studied neurology, but I don't pretend to know all the answers, which is why I have these types of conversations, is because it interests me, and I learn more about other people's perspectives and things that I can incorporate into mine by having these types of dialogues. So my perception is that what we perceive as ourselves, what we perceive as us, is an emergent property of our biology. So you would classify me as a materialist in that fashion. No, I don't completely omit the possibility that there could be some sort of supernatural component. I am an atheist, obviously, but I don't think it's probable. And one of the reasons that I believe that and come to those conclusions is because you can make augmentations to the brain that cause a direct reflection in the manifestation of your personality and your ability to perceive. And I find it incredibly difficult to reconcile the fact that those augmentations can take place and have that effect with the mind or the soul, as you define them, existing independent of that physical matter. Did that make sense? Did I articulate that okay?
Yeah. That's the number one objection people typically get when you propose idealism or substance dualism. It's we can, make changes in the brain. And I've heard, I remember listening to Joshua Moritz. He's a Christian and a physicalist, and he was using a lot of the same arguments as well, that you can sort of change the brain. He was citing some studies like brain damage has caused people to change their entire political views or develop depression or all sorts of types of things. So it seems as though when we change and affect the brain, it seems to change the soul, so to speak. Yeah. And I would simply say, well, yeah, exactly. That's the whole point. In my view, in the idealist perspective, of the soul has to be malleable. It would be a direct prediction of idealism. What we say is fundamental, is irreducible itself, would be consciousness. That can't be, or if it is, it's really hard to see how it could be an emergent property of the brain. Now, the idea about your personality, your beliefs, we would expect these to be malleable, because I don't have the same beliefs now that I had 20 years ago. And it's from reading, conversations, interactions in the physical world that have caused me to sort of change my beliefs. And thus my soul, then, in that sense, my personality has grown, has changed. So, we would expect the soul itself to be malleable. It would have to be. As we were talking about on Steve McGracian a little bit before I had to get off. But so what would it go, of course, then I think the next question would naturally be, what is the brain then? What's the point of it all? If you can
what are we one of those?
Yeah. So, substance dualist says there's mind and brain. And my view as an idealist is that's just unnecessary. When we look at the brain itself, we would say the brain activity is, the phenomenal representation of one's inner life. So a good way to think this, to word it, is, it's like, if there was a conscious agent, this is how it appears in a sort of physical reality. It's a representation of what it would look like. So in other words, the brain is the third person experience of someone's first person conscious experience. They're not different substances. They interact. They're intricately connected in that kind of sense. So, we would expect, a hit of the brain to sort of affect the inner life. I mean, as Bernardo Kastrup says, for the same reason that thoughts disrupt emotions, physical interference with the brain disrupts the organism's inner life, because that is the phenomenal or the physical representation of an agent itself interacting within a physical environment like we are right now. So, I mean, go ahead. Yeah.
I'm so sorry. No, not at all. It's interesting, but I have so many questions and I don't want to lose them, because there's a lot of depth to go into there.
Yeah.
So initially you said, as an idealist, and I could be misclassifying this because I don't profess to be adept at all in philosophy. I'm trying to learn, but it's not something that Yeah, absolutely. So you essentially said idealists see it from the opposite perspective, that the mind or the soul kind of manifest matter. And I can kind of understand that, because without your perceptions registering that the external world exists, to you at least, it wouldn't. Like if you didn't have senses to be able to perceive and intake what you're that's the word I'm looking for, perceiving, I guess, for lack of a better word, external of you, it wouldn't exist, at least to you. So I can understand that. But how do you reconcile it manifesting the matter that allows it to exist? Because at least from this perspective, the brain itself would have to be some sort of mechanism that allows the soul or the mind to be viable in any sort of meaningful way. Because without the brain, they couldn't be viable in any meaningful way. So they couldn't manifest that matter, because that matter is necessary in order for them to exist. Or am I looking at that from an incorrect perspective?
We would say the matter of the brain is not necessary for, a conscious agent to exist. We would say that this is like the physical representation. It kind of, that could be a way to word it. I'd have to think about that actual term. I mean, I tend to use the just idea. It's like this physical representation. So, I mean, a good analogy I was thinking about the other day would be just think of like computer games. If I were to play a game in, World of Warcraft, I don't play games, so I'm trying to think of one. World of Warcraft.
Fortnite. I have an 8-year-old. Fortnite. That's a good one.
I have kids. No way, it's time for that. But I would have some sort of avatar of myself in that world so that I could move about and sort of explore what it. Now, if you kill the character, I get disconnected from the game and I'm kind of out at like the start screen, I guess you could say. Maybe there's a way to resurrect yourself in there or something. So there has to be, if you're going to interact in a physical environment, you would need some sort of physical representation to sort of go about. And we would say that's mainly the brain, and to the extension, the body itself. So it's not so much that the consciousness is dependent upon the brain. It's that the brain is just simply the physical representation of how the conscious agent sort of acts within the world, kind of like an interface, I guess you could say.
Doesn't that put you in the realm of simulation theory, though?
You mean like the idea of simulation?
Yeah, like if your soul and your mind exist irrespective of you, and you're essentially just a vessel so that your soul and mind can exist in this realm, this physical world isn't necessary and doesn't, and to any sort of meaningful degree may not even really exist ultimately if you're just kind of temporarily acting out through this body.
That's a good thing to bring up. I'm glad you brought that up. I do actually hold very much the simulation theory as my.
Do you really? That makes sense.
Yeah, I've done a lot of videos on that. I did a video over the summer called The Emergent Universe. I did a video just called Was Life Inevitable, where I brought evolutionary biology into it all. So I have been connecting dots to simulation theory for a while. So no, I'm glad you brought that up, because this is why I made the distinction in the beginning between the soul and the mind. Sure, you could say consciousness does exist so much without the physical world. It's not necessary, but it is for a soul, so to speak, because souls are built up over time. I'm not the same person I was tomorrow. I'm not the same person I'll be in 50 years in that sense. My personality is going to change, grow, and develop. Sometimes Christian theologians talk about something called a soul-building theodicy, which is we are, in this world to build souls, and souls build up to get to a certain point. In that sense, you do kind of need a physical environment to sort of build your character, so to speak, up. Think about, again, the video game analogy. You can level up in the game to get to a certain.
So is this like a training ground, like a proving ground for souls?
From your perspective? That's kind of a caricature of it. But yeah.
Like to garner experiences?
Yeah. I mean, in Christian theology, the purpose, more or less, if I'm going to sum it up really quickly, is to for souls to learn to love, to be loved back, to experience the joy of love and whatnot. And that takes time to develop, to get past, prideful, selfish desires. I was talking about this when I did my video on hell back in December. So basically, yeah, it's kind of like developing soul, so to speak, to sort of, if Christianity is true, of course, to sort of love God and be loved back by God. And so, yeah, you would expect so much a physical environment to sort of help grow souls, so to speak. And that's essentially what life is. I mean, you're not the same person you were 5 years ago. I'm sure when your son goes off to college, you'll be a different person as well. Those experiences change and morph you. And it's so, the soul is so malleable. Like, let me prove it to you. Let me prove how malleable your soul is right now. Okay. Think of a white rabbit. You can't help but think of a white rabbit. Now, that thought in your head, that's part of your soul, so to speak. It could easily form a memory that could last. Remember that time Mike made me think of a white rabbit. So, yeah, it's very malleable. Souls are very interconnected with the physical world, with ourselves and whatnot, or with, each and every other person. So, yeah, we would need this kind of physical, world to sort of just become who we are, or who we're meant to be, so to speak.
So do you think that if we didn't have a physical representation, that if we were entirely non-corporeal, then we wouldn't be able to garner the experiences necessary in order to be able to adequately reflect a love towards God or understand each other? Like why, I guess what I'm getting at is, why is this physical state, if we exist elsewise, even a necessity?
Well, what would be the alternative then? I guess I need to get a little more clarification. Like, what would be the alternative to this?
Well, it sounds like you think that there's some sort of eternal, and I could be completely misrepresenting you. Please correct me if I am, because I'm just going by what I'm gleaning. So it sounds like you feel as though there's some sort of eternalness to the spirit, perhaps is a better word to use, because you make a differentiation between soul and mind that I think is valuable and should be retained. So our spirit would exist in sort of an eternal fashion, but in order to garner valuable experiences that we wouldn't be able to get otherwise, we need to instantiate a physical form. And if we need to instantiate a physical form in order to be able to have those experiences. So, but there's a point. The point to those experiences, from your perspective, if I'm hearing correctly, is to understand love and to understand pain, and to understand making choices, and one of those choices being to honor God. Why is this physical instantiation necessary? Why aren't these things that we could just go through in our spiritual state without having to make this stopover?
Well, so let's talk about this spiritual state. This kind of like, see, when people say that, we tend to think of like this ghostly realm where all these ghosts are just sort of floating around talking, and is that kind of what
I mean? No, I'm not thinking of a ghostly realm. I'm not even sure that it's something that I could manifest an image of.
Yeah.
Really. So to be completely fair, but in order to accept the premise that well, actually, this would be an important question then. Do you think that the soul, mind, and or spirit, or all three of them that kind of inhabit us or manifest as us, is probably a better way of saying it, that manifest as us, existed prior to us and will exist after? Or do you think they only exist in this moment as us?
That's a good question. So that's good thing you brought it up. So now the soul, our souls obviously are, as I said, built up over time. It did not exist prior to, us physically being born or conceived or whatnot. Under the idealist perspective, consciousness is fundamental. It can't be reduced to physical parts. Excuse me. So we wouldn't say so much that consciousness came into existence at that point. Right. Among idealists is this idea that there's some sort of like fundamental consciousness to reality. So Bernardo Kastrup talks about, what if the universe is having a multiple personality disorder, so to speak? and where there is this fundamental consciousness. And then when a soul begins, consciousness sort of like distinguishes itself around a specific soul. And then there's this idea of disassociation from the rest of the universe. It sort of starts up. Now that's kind of esoteric in what I'm saying. So an analogy might help. Think of like a stream, an endless stream of water going on. And the stream is analogous to sort of like this fundamental consciousness. And then at some points in the stream, whirlpools start. Now, you can't really tell where the whirlpool begins and ends, but it's in the stream and you can clearly go, whirlpool, I see it right there. That's kind of what we're getting at with like this idea of these souls sort of starting. So you have this underlying fundamental consciousness. And again, the reason I pause that, maybe we can get into later about the hard problem of consciousness and everything. And then, but so you have this fundamental stream of consciousness.
There's so much.
I'm thinking of starting to read a 700-page book on all of it right now. I'm not sure if I really want to do that, but yeah.
It probably scratches the surface too. That's the fascinating thing about this topic. Yeah. But anyway, sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt you. Keep going.
No, but yeah, so you have this stream of consciousness and you have like these whirlpools of like these individuals happening. So we wouldn't say that, you existed prior to your conception. I didn't exist prior to my conception, but consciousness kind of did. And at that point, consciousness became sort of disassociated with the rest of it and sort of focused on this kind of individual aspect.
So we existed as components of a larger whole.
Right.
And kind of conglomerated into something that was tangibly different from the whole, but was still a part of the whole. And then we go back, our components reabsorb into the whole. Because then where does the self exist before and after that, or does it only exist in a temporary state when that conglomeration takes place?
Well, the self, I would say, has sort of just always been there. But once what exactly do we mean by a self? If we mean by it being the soul, then it sort of came into existence, but there was this fundamental underlying consciousness which allowed it to sort of disassociate around that idea. And so there was a sense of the self at that certain point. But there was always sort of consciousness there. And so in one sense, there was some sort of larger consciousness as just as having a multiple personality effect type thing.
Okay, so there's a larger consciousness and it has some sort of like dissociative identity disorder, multiple personality disorder, and it manifests as individuals that are still a part of the collective consciousness, but are separate and distinct for the period while they exist.
Mm-hmm.
And if they're separate and distinct for the period when they exist, when they are reabsorbed, I guess, or transcend, are they still separate and distinct?
Yeah, I would say that we would always still have a sense of ourselves, but I think we'll also have a sense of unity in that kind of sense. Now, I mean, anything beyond death is just going to be speculative at this point. I'm not going to pretend to know.
Or before.
Yeah.
Or before birth.
Yeah. But I mean, specifically, if I'm going to tie back into my Christian perspective here, Christians don't think we're going to go to heaven. Now, a lot of Christians say that.
Some do.
Yeah.
Some do.
Because if you read the New Testament,
they're getting a cloud, Mike.
Yeah.
Some of them do.
But the New Testament doesn't really talk about that as like the end result. The New Testament talks about resurrection. So the physical aspect of it is so utterly important that for eternity, we're supposed to have it. And we're supposed to be physically resurrected in space-time on this earth and then reign over the whole cosmos in that sense. So just in a nutshell, what I get from reading like the New Testament, and specifically scholar N.T. Wright, is that when the resurrection happens, it'll be our job to turn the entire universe into Eden. So there is a physical component that's extremely important to us. We're not supposed to just be this, reabsorb back into the collective and never have this unique distinctness about us. So I don't take that perspective. I do think the physical, even as an idealist, because you and I we're both monists. We're not substance dualists. The physical is important aspects of us, although I would say it's not the fundamental aspect of us.
Okay. All right. I think I understand your perspective a little bit better, and thank you for that. And thank you for tolerating my questions. I'm probably going to have a lot. Feel free to shoot them back at me too. You can shoot them back at me because I'm gonna have so many. You're gonna. So what you alluded to, and this is, I think, the crux of our conversation, and what I really want to get into now that I understand your perspective a little bit better. And if you don't feel comfortable yet, if you wanted to ask me a bit more about mine, please feel free to stop me. But why don't you explain to me, because others have tried, and I have a difficult time figuring out what the problem is. What's the hard problem of consciousness?
Okay, that's a great question. Okay, so I actually thought about this when you mentioned it before the show a little bit, and it just popped in my head a couple of minutes ago. Sam Harris, I think he's actually really good at explaining the hard problem. If you don't, if I don't do good, try to look up some videos of Sam Harris explaining the hard problem. I disagree with him on a lot of things, but I think he's very articulate and really well spoken. He's good at explaining it. So maybe try to channel him a little bit and see if I can explain it what he terms. Okay. So if you think about right now your inner mental world, you may think of memories, you may think of emotions you have, feelings, hatred towards me,
yes, definitely. That's the one.
Well, you might experience terror from my face. It happens all the time. But
no, not that one. Just the hatred.
Yeah. I wouldn't trust his face in an alley if he was trying to sell me. But so think of all that. Now you're getting this idea of emotions, feelings, sensations. None of that, though, none of that inner mental world you can think of is getting you to brain chemistry or electrical signals, firing in your head or synapses happening. If you think of taste, it's an electrical signal that goes from, in such layman terms, it's an electrical signal that goes from your tongue into the brain. But what distinguishes it from a sweet taste or a salty taste or a sour taste? It's all kind of the same. It's all electrical signals. How is a mental world coming out of all these just physical electrical interactions and whatnot? Where is the self-aware agent in the brain? Because if you open the brain, you're not going to see colors, qualia. You're not going to see tastes or sensations, feelings, emotions. You're going to see more electrical signals. You're going to see more chemicals happen. You're going to see, gray matter. You're not going to see. So how does this inner mental world, everything we experience, come out of just physical matter? That's the hard problem of consciousness. Then take it to the next step. So, but real quick, I'll just say everything we experience is mental back at us. So we experience a world of colors, shapes, sensations, taste, smells. Everything we experience is mental. Where is the physical in that? So the hard problem that, philosophers are wrestling with, if you read people like Ned Block, John Sear, John Eccles, David Chalmers, it's why all we experience is mental. All we know is mental, but somehow isn't this supposed to come out of just a physical brain? The electrical signals just firing in our head. That's essentially the hard problem. And I'll let you ask questions if that helped explain it at all.
Okay. So other people have posed it to me in a similar fashion. And one of the reasons that I don't see it as an issue or a problem necessarily is because we can map and see those manifestations. So if our brain is built specifically, or not our brain, because our brain is a cohesive unit that includes midbrain structures and our cerebellum, which don't factor into this, but most of our cortices and some of our midbrain structures are designed specifically in order to make us aware of our environment. So that we can exist within the environment, so that we can find mates, so that we can find food, so that we can avoid danger, so that we can stay safe, so that we can find ways to be comfortable, so that we can, be healthy and happy. Like all of those things exist for us in our brain in order to make us, live and be happy and be content. So we can look at our brain and we can see areas that manifest consciousness, kind of, to a certain degree, or we can speculate that there are areas that seem to be involved. Like if we look at the thalamaic structures, like the thalamus seems to be involved a lot in taking our physical perceptual experiences, the things that we take in through our senses, and incorporating them into, comparing them against our memory, comparing them against other patterns that we've seen, comparing them against other experiences we've had, and forming a cohesive unit. Like we can see, if we look at, functional magnetic resonance imaging and in EEGs, we can see activation in these regions when these types of perceptions are happening and recall, and we can see that that's where it takes place. So it makes sense to me that if there's a brain region or multiple brain regions that we can see activating to create these experiences, we can make a logical inference that they're involved in making these experiences. And just because we can't fully explain it yet, that doesn't mean that the explanation is that it's non-corporeal and it exists outside of us and there's something else influencing our brain. To me, it just seems as though, okay, there's things that we don't know about how our brain functions. Undeniably, there's things that we don't know. But what we do know leads us to think that perhaps it's logical to conclude that they're manifesting this for us and that there are reasons that this is the case.
So think about that, though. So you have a brain region that does correlate with some sort of subjective experience or some sort of subjective feeling. Now, when you look at that region, you don't actually, I'm getting back to just the hard problem of why even people
keep me on track. Keep me on track, Mike. I fly off the rails.
So my response to that, I can get into later why I think there's actually a lot of good evidence to suggest that the brain is not creating consciousness, and this is just correlations, or these would be physical manifestations of a conscious agent.
Well, what else would you expect to see if not correlations, though? Sorry to interrupt you, but what would you expect to see if not correlative information when it comes to the brain? Like, it's not like we can stick an electrode in the brain and the electrode can send us back, okay, this is where he tastes salt, right? Like, it's not going to feed a computer that information. Like, essentially all we have to go on is consistently reading correlative behaviors and also causing damages to those areas or regions of the brain and seeing people no longer being able to manifest that. Like, if you damage the Wernicke's or Broca's area of the brain, you will no longer be able to either understand or create speech 100% of the time, right? Like, that's correlative, but it's pretty conclusive in my mind.
Right. So what do you mean? What would I expect? What would I expect? What?
Well, what would you expect in a brain in order for you to say, oh, okay, the brain is what manifests consciousness? Like, what could somebody show you? Like, what study, what chart, what graph could somebody show you that you'd be like, oh, okay, totally comes from the brain?
I think we would need to get back to the hard problem itself and why it is such a hard problem, because we're not seeing, when we see those regions of the brain associated with conscious experience, we're not seeing directly this sort of subjective inner world that we experience. We're just seeing these electrical signals going off, and that's correlating with what a subject is telling us that they would be experiencing or whatnot. The question is you have like this electrical stuff happening in like the gray matter, whatnot, and then on the other side you have the subjective thought of maybe like a bunny, someone picturing a bunny rabbit. How does this electrical signal sort of arrange itself to sort of manifest in sort of like this inner subjective experience that would be a consciousness? And that's just the mental information. We still haven't gotten to the act of the brain somehow becoming self-aware itself and just becoming consciousness. So I think what I would need to see, and I'm not even sure how this would be done, but somehow someone would need to explain how the brain can somehow create consciousness, what it is in sort of, I need to see some sort of like material representation of it and whatnot. So I've heard some materialists tell me that gamma synchrony in the brain is consciousness. Well, no, that's gamma synchrony, and gamma synchrony could correlate with consciousness. But I wouldn't say that it is consciousness. So it's really hard to get from the gap between, get over the gap between this sort of inner mental world of what we're experiencing to, or from these electrical signals, these chemical signals. And what the idealist says, if we flip it the other way around, it actually makes far more sense, because everything that's fundamental is what we experience. It's this world of subjectivity. It's this world of feelings, qualia, experiences. And then that just simply has a physical representation of itself. So a personality needs to manifest, or a will needs to sort of manifest somehow in the physical world. And the physical representation would just simply be these electrical signals, just like, lightning is just sort of the manifestation of electrons interacting and whatnot. It's not, what we actually, this again goes back to the hard problem. What we actually see when we see color or lightning is not actually what's there. That's, these different wavelengths hitting the receptors in the eyes, chemically being transferred through electrical signals to the brain, and then that's sort of loading up this image. The question is, how do you get to that sort of thing? And so that is the hard problem itself that philosophers.
So is it why we consistently have like the same sort of perception? Sorry to interrupt you. So when you say lightning, I'm still desperately trying to understand what the problem is. And excuse my what's the problem, Mike? What's your problem? So is the problem that, so I perceive lightning and you perceive lightning. We're separate and autonomous. Both of us register that as lightning, and both of us have an experience of lightning, but neither of us can point to our brain and say that's the lightning part of our brain, where our brain holds the information that tells us that this is lightning.
Well, not so much it's the brain that tells us that part is lightning. We can't look inside the brain and see, there is the mental image of lightning. So we see mental lightning, but when we look at the brain, we don't see the mental image of lightning. So,
but like if you looked at a computer, you don't see, like if I email you a picture of lightning, you can't look at a motherboard on a computer and say, well, there's the lightning, but you know that there's a component of that computer that has translated that information and then manifests it as a picture of lightning. Like I'm not in front of you right now, but you can see me because a computer is transmitting my image to you, but there's no physical representation of my image on the computer. Like you can't open a computer and look and see me.
Right. That's a good analogy, but that's basically what idealists are saying, is that the physical is sort of just transferring the mental information. The mental information itself is not like so much emergent from the physical in that sense. There's this underlying information, so to speak, that we could study and look at the same way we could look at a computer, and that correlates directly with sort of the mental experience. So because these things sort of reduced information, that would be like sort of like an analogous argument for idealism that idealists often use when trying to explain these types of things. So that's what we would expect. If physicalism was true, that the brain sort of creates consciousness, we keep having to wonder why, when we look at the brain, we're not sort of seeing these sort of mental things sort of manifesting in the brain. We don't see anything. And then that relates directly to consciousness. I mean, there's so many different theories about how the brain could create consciousness, and there's always counterexamples to that. Like for some people, there's some theory that maybe consciousness is some sort of this global thing that a complicated brain sort of creates. So the more complex brains got through evolution, they started generating consciousness. Well, that sort of has problems, because what about cases of hydrocephalus where there's mostly liquid in the brain and there's just a little bit of gray matter? If consciousness is sort of this global creation of all this complexity, why do people with this case generate consciousness as well? And so the real question is how is the brain generating consciousness? And if we could ever explain that,
is the cerebellum intact though in those cases? Like in cases of hydrocephalus, even though there's not a lot of gyri-rich cortical structures on top of the cerebellum, which is the lower component of your brain. So I don't know how much you know about neural anatomy, probably a fair bit, but essentially there's the part of the brain that we think of as the brain is the like sort of you know, it looks like some spaghetti, kind of like really thick spaghetti that's all piled together and is in two hemispheres, and that it's on top. In the middle of that, there's midbrain regions like the hippocampus, the hypothalamus, the amygdala, the thalamus. Like all of those are kind of sitting in between the cortical structures and the cerebellum. And the cerebellum is like it's referred to as like the reptilian brain, and that is what connects the cortical structures where most of our thinking and stuff takes place with the rest of our body via our brain stem. And in the cerebellum is where most of our autonomic nervous system is resting. Like you don't have to think about your heart beating, your heart just beats, and that's because your cerebellum exists. But nobody knows that it's just limited to that, but we do know that that's where those functions take place.
Right.
It would make some logical sense from an evolutionary standpoint that if we could have developed consciousness before we developed rich cortical structures by virtue of our systems becoming more complex and requiring self-awareness in order to be able to function. Like the more complex the system is, the more those systems need to be able to communicate with each other via intricate networks. And if those intricate networks start to send enough signals back and forth and need to be aware of enough signals on multiple fronts, then you would almost have to develop almost like an artificial intelligence in order to be able to manage those systems and take in perceptions. That could be the birth of consciousness, and that could have happened at a lower cerebral level before we manifested more cortical structures. So my question would be, are cerebellum still intact? Because if that's the case, they could have consciousness because conscious awareness took place in those lower order regions before we developed the richness of intellect that we have now because of our fuller cortical structures.
Right, and that's something I wouldn't really have too many issues with. My how I would sort of like answer that back is you can have communication and interconnections in a brain without necessarily having consciousness. I mean, you just think of a computer.
For sure.
I don't think this computer is conscious, but it connects, it talks to one another. So why would that be? That again goes back to the hard problem. That's not really what consciousness is, because they're not the same thing. You don't
self-awareness probably is more so.
Yeah, like you don't really need that to have sort of connections and talking to one another and that type of sense. I mean, very simple organisms. I forget the name of it, but they don't really need to have these complexities to sort of survive, or they don't need to be. They may not even need a consciousness to survive if it is there in these simplistic organisms. But you can have the connectivity without the consciousness in that sense. So if that's what consciousness is, where's the connection that would show the emergence of it?
The emergence of like the connection in the brain that would show the emergence of consciousness?
Yeah,
that's a hard question.
Well, that's you just said it. That's a hard question. That's exactly it. You got it.
I did it.
That's the hard problem. It's okay, well, why do we need consciousness then? Like, where does it come in? Because you can have the connectivity without the consciousness. And then there's so many things I can think of that materialists or physicalists have predicted would happen in the brain if the brain creates. So let me give you one example. I was looking at this. I was looking at this before my debate with T-Jump, and I didn't get a chance to bring it up. So it was assumed for years that psychedelic states produced in the brain from things like LSD or psilocybin produce psychedelic wild experiences. It was predicted that would correlate with increased brain activity, because if the brain's creating experience and consciousness, you would expect wild experiences to correlate with higher experiences. I mean, a lot of times during these
activation regions.
Yeah, I mean, your heart rate goes up. I mean, your heartbeat goes faster. People sometimes sweat. There's clearly something happening in the body when people are on LSD. So, but numerous studies have shown that the exact opposite. In fact, brain activity decreases by around 20%. So Christoph Kochen said, to the great surprise of many, psilocybin, a potent psychedelic, reduces brain activity. And so just to give a couple studies, if anyone wants to look at it, you can look up things like 2-dose investigations of the 5-HT.
Why would they expect that though? Like that it surprises me that they would expect that though, because you're having internal phenomenological experiences at that point. your external perceptions and your ability to operate start to become dampened at that point. So the brain regions that you use to be able to navigate the world would be dampened, and the brain regions that you use in order to take in external perceptions would be dampened. And that's a huge amount of brain, right? Like that's a huge amount of brain that's no longer being used. The only portion of your brain that's intensely active by the sounds of it is the portion of your brain that generates internalized perceptions. Like if you look at somebody who's in a REM state, like if you are in a dreaming state, you could be in complete sleep paralysis, even like not even be able to move or responsive to external stimuli to your senses, like if somebody pinches you. But you could be having just incredibly lucid, really insane dreams, which would be kind of similar on that scale, but have low manifestation of brain activity because the regions required, like the hefty regions that are required for perceiving and navigating aren't being activated during that time because they're not required. So well, that one kind of makes sense to me, because the external stuff, the stuff that you need to exist as a functional friggin' person, are shut down, and the only thing that's happening is the part inside of you that's like, party, colors.
Well, the interesting thing in some of these studies, I mean, I think one was like in 2016, is they were focusing on these specific regions where you would have those experiences. So they're not focusing on motor functions when they're giving these subjects psilocybin and studying. So they are looking.
What activation regions were they looking at then? Like were
they're looking at the specific regions you would have these types of experiences in. I mean, and they're just trying to understand why brain.
But if they know what regions you have experiences in, why isn't that part of consciousness?
Well,
what's the experience region, Mike? What's the experience region?
That's the hard problem. Is that really the experience region? Is it just correlating in some ways? So yeah, you would expect certain brain activities to change. So like if I'm having a hallucination, my brain activity would obviously be different now than me experiencing this, you know, the external world around us and whatnot. And by the way, objective idealists like myself don't deny there's some sort of external world. So you know, but they're not. The brain activity is not what was predicted by neuroscientists in these experiments, because it was predicted that the brain would have to sort of create these experiences somehow. You know, obviously it goes back to the hard problem, but somehow, and that would need to correlate with increased brain activity, because it's this reductionist idea is always bottom up production happening. Yeah. And so it's just one of those things in the materialist paradigm that was unexpected, I guess you could say, once you sort of looking at the studies and what they were expecting and what came out. So yeah, I wouldn't expect the, you know, like, you know, when I am not walking, I don't expect, you know, certain
your motor cortex isn't going to be like, we're walking now.
Yeah. Yeah. It's crazy though, but you see what we're kind of getting into. We're trying to, it's very easy in our current culture to not want to explain all of these experiences with looking at the brain. That's very much how our culture thinks in that kind of sense. And that's why it's really hard for a lot of people to accept idealism, because we're saying flip everything over, start over. And even I catch myself going back to the materialist paradigm and thinking in those terms. And it's very hard not to, because it's something we've been told all of our lives. And so, yeah, I get where you're coming from when you say that.
It also makes some intuitive and logical sense too, especially if you're somebody who's taken a really long, hard look at brains, right? Mm-hmm. Like I can understand your perspective. I'm hoping maybe after this conversation you can understand mine a little bit better too. Like when you spend a lot of time, because I studied perceptual cognition, so I studied the eye, for example, pretty extensively. Like visual cortex is my jam, because that's visual and auditory cortex, especially when you study communication theory, are incredibly important. Auditory, you would think would be the most important because you listen in order to communicate, but it's actually visual cues that are the most important. Auditory cortex, like your temporal lobe is essentially just kind of transcribing things for you. The information that you receive through your visual cortex holy smokes, everything that you see is upside down, backwards, and full of holes. Everything that you see is upside down, backwards, and full of holes because of the way that our eyes are built. Our eyes are garbage, right? And our brain puts it together. Like we transmit over an optic chiasm, like this visual field hits this side of the eye, this visual field hits this side of the eye, and then our brain puts it together into a cohesive image. Like when you follow all of that, when you realize that just something you take for granted, like seeing, has to travel through your optic nerves, cross over the optic chiasm, both visual fields have to unify, even though the information's coming from completely separate eyes into one picture from either side, go into the occipital lobe, become a unified picture that we're interpreting based on previous experiences, go to the hippocampus, compare against other experiences in order to be able to understand what it is you're even seeing. And all of that happens instantaneously. Like it makes sense to me, even just looking at that small component of how your brain functions and what it's capable of doing, that why wouldn't it be capable of unifying all of that to make me me?
All of it. Yeah, the issue is that there's a lot of problems again with the neural binding problem of where sort of unification going. Now, the interesting thing though, let me give you kind of my perspective on kind of the stuff you were talking about and try to give you just a different perspective. When you were sort of explaining all this, it sort of almost kind of fits with what I'm talking about in idealism, that all of this is sort of
I'm not helping you, am I? God damn it. That wasn't part of my plan.
Well, I think we can both look at the data and give pretty different perspectives on it. But just think about all that's sort of happening. And yet somehow that's sort of supposed to be what visual perceptions are. It's if there's all these problems in the materialist ways to sort of explain these complicated, chemical signals and passages kind of going through. I'm just summarizing what you're basically saying in my own words. But if that's all that's sort of kind of going and sort of uploading, to me, I would say I'm not really sure that's what that would be. And it just makes more sense to say that, that's just sort of the physical manifestation of the way a conscious agent would perceive the world. And it's sort of like carrying the underlying information that the conscious agent would see. So the idealist basically, let me try to give a little bit more clarification.
Because I'm not sure I get that.
Yeah, what the idealist is basically saying, though, is like, take one step back from the neuroscience for just a second. What do we see? Well, we see qualia, we see shapes, we see colors, we sense smells, sensations, feelings. All of these are mental. Everything we experience is mental. Why posit a physical world beyond what we already experience to sort of explain where these mental experiences are coming from? It makes far more sense, it's far more parsimonious just to simply say that everything we experience is mental, therefore everything simply is mental. And what we would call the physical is just sort of like the representations of the mental on an information type level. So it's just sort of like the computer code underneath the video game in that kind of sense. And so, but then
kind of like a proximal distal stimulus problem.
What do you mean by that?
Like proximal distal. Okay, so there's a theory of perception.
Yeah.
It's not even really a theory of perception. That so there's two types of stimulus. There's proximal stimulus and distal stimulus. Distal stimulus, I may get these reversed, and if I do, forgive me. But one of them, if I'm remembering correctly, distal stimulus is the external stimulus, the stimulus that exists outside of you. That may be proximal. If I get the reversed, I'm sorry.
That's okay.
The other one is the one that exists in your perception. So the one that you're actually consciously aware of, that would be the distal stimulus. The proximal stimulus, I believe I'm having this correct, is the one that exists outside of you. So if you look at a tree, that tree is the proximal stimulus. That tree exists irrespective of you. The distal stimulus is your subjective experience of the tree. Your subjective experience of the tree is not the tree. It's an image, a manifestation that you create to represent the tree in order to understand that tree exists. And that's a conglomeration of things that have happened in your past that you have access to.
So then let
that
me ask.
allow you the knowledge that tree is a tree, like previously seeing a tree, somebody telling you that's a tree. That's auditory information, visual stimulus. You saw that, somebody told you it was a tree. Hearing the sound of wind going through the leaves of the tree, that gives you another conceptualization of what a tree is. Previously smelling the sap of a tree, that gives you another component of the conceptualization of the tree. All of those sensory experiences unify to give you a general conceptualization in your mind of what a tree is. So when you see a tree, that's your reference point for that distal stimulus of, okay, I'm registering seeing a tree. I recognize a tree.
But think about that. Now you have these two stimuli. Why posit that there has to be two when everything you know, everything you experience, everything you need to do science is all going to be mental anyway?
So
why
you
go
think that you
beyond
make a
that?
tree and then you project a tree into the world, and
Well,
then the
not
tree
so
exists? Because
much. So
that's
like,
what I don't get.
okay, well let me teach you an analogy. So if you were in a video game and you saw a tree, would that
Okay.
really be there outside of the video game manifestation of the tree?
Outside of the video, well, if I'm in the video game, like I'm not outside holding the controller, from my perception, I'm existing in the video game. If that's the way you're asking the question, then somebody programmed that tree to exist in the video game in order for me to perceive it, and it exists completely independent from me.
Right.
So that tree exists irrespective of me, and I am perceiving it.
Exactly.
Right?
And this is why I'm an objective idealist. I'm not a subjective idealist. I do think there is an external world beyond us, but it's just mental. Because if you're in that video game world, it's not a separate thing. It's not something that's not mental.
But I didn't make that tree happen.
No, you didn't. But it did upload the information, upload it. So when you turn around in the video game, the one thing you need to remember is that it's not still there. It's just code in some sense. And when you turn back around, the code re-uploads based on what whoever is playing to sort of see that tree there. So there's information there, and it's basically just sort of in one sense or another code. So it's when I would say, when we look at idealism, yeah, it's mental. What we experience is really there in a mental sense, because I'm an objective idealist. So we really do see a tree, but there's no need to posit a sort of physical substance beyond the mental thing we're already experiencing. I would say it's not parsimonious.
Then where's the tree?
It's what you're
Why are we seeing a tree?
Well, it's what you're mentally experiencing, and we're all experiencing like a larger mental world in that kind of sense. And so think about it like this. David Hume proposed something called bundle theory. So bundle theory basically is the idea that everything is composed of properties, and without properties, there's nothing there. And idealists hear this and we get excited because thank you, David Hume, for giving us this argument. So if I were to look at that tree, I can see shape, I can see color. If I touch it, I can have a sensation. Science tells us, though, that most of what is actually there is 99.99999% empty space. There's really no color associated with the tree. It's just specific wavelength hitting the tree and bouncing off, which is hitting our eye. So it really doesn't have a color. It's really mostly empty space. What's left of a physical object to be there, especially if you take away all of the mental properties? And so idealists just say, well, yeah, that's it. It's all mental.
So I'm still.
But
the tree, but the tree's there, Mike.
I agree.
The tree exists. The tree physically exists external of you.
Exactly, so, I agree.
Okay,
it does exist, but it's not it's not physical.
If you weren't there, the tree would still exist. This is a question that'll help me understand. If you never saw that tree, if Mike never laid eyes on that tree and no other human ever laid eyes on that tree, is there a tree?
Yes and no. So
God damn it.
So the physical thing is not there. It would never be brown, trunk with green leaves. What would be there is the basic information that could be uploaded when a conscious aegis comes upon it. Same what you kind of would get in a video game. If I never turn the video game on, the information is still there. It just never uploads to how I experience in that sense. So,
So it physically exists, but its conceptualization as a human would register and perceive it doesn't exist until it's perceived by that human.
right. And so, but
I'm with you
basically,
there.
yeah. So basically, all there is the
I agree with that.
information. All there is
Yes, that I agree.
the underlying information, but that's all mental. I mean, this is the one things that idealists try to bring up constantly is every time we do science, we're basically we're assuming a mental world, and that's essentially idealism. When we study the underlying things of what makes something physical, we get kind of confused because we're 99.9999% empty space. We don't really have colors. I mean, these are all sort of just mental phenomena that somehow, if you're looking at it from a materialist sense, you kind of this somehow have to go through the chemicals and sort of upload. And the idealist says, this just sounds like idealism with extra steps. Let's just accept what we see.
How does idealism account for the existence of colors then any better than somebody who's a materialist would account for the existence of colors? Because I could say colors, like us being able to perceive different wavelengths existed because evolutionarily or just physically it makes more sense for us to be able to perceive the color spectrum as different so that we can better navigate the world. And we're not even the best at it. Like there's birds that can see 3 more colors than us, and there's ants that can see polarization in the atmosphere. Like we're not that great, but it exists because it was beneficial for us to be able to have those manifestations, so that when they occurred, they kind of stuck because those that were capable of having those types of perceptions in that fashion thrive. So how would you account for it from an idealist perspective? Why colors? Because why?
Well, I mean, we would say that the colors is really there, and when we study what the physical thing is beyond, the specific wavelength, we would say that's the information that carries the color. So it's it's there in an information sense, and so this is what when we study science,
we agree on that.
What we get. I'm kind of confused with what you mean. Why that would be a problem?
But like I can explain why we perceive colors, like why we have an experience of different colors. Like if we learn, for example, that if there's 2 fruits that are exactly identical and one of them is red and the other one is yellow, the red one, or berries, the red ones are bad and the yellow ones are good. Like people eat the red ones and they die, and people eat the yellow ones and they live for a really long time and they're super nutritional and everything's awesome. So even though if we weren't able to perceive the color differential between the 2 of them, more of us would probably die because we ate the red ones. So there's us being able to manifest those perceptions makes some sense from that perspective. But from an idealist perspective, why do colors even need to exist?
Well, I think it goes back to what we were talking in the beginning. We need some sort of tools, I guess you could say, to sort of operate within the physical manifestation of reality. And that, so I mean, these would just simply be observations on the idealist perspective itself. We would account for it basically the same way you kind of do. We just wouldn't agree that it's manifested, it's sort of created by the brain. We would say, that the color really is there. And then the physical representation of it, how it is perceived by a conscious agent, is sort of manifested in the brain. So when color encounters a conscious agent, there is going to be a sort of physical representation in some sense or another, and that's how it is perceived in the brain. Interestingly enough, though, I don't have them on me right now, but there have been some studies which show that different cultures will perceive colors slightly differently, depending on where you come from and how you're raised. And I do remember reading something about ancient people may not have been able to see the color blue. That it didn't. Really? Yeah, there was something else. I have to find it again. But so, for example,
the sky is blue. What?
Well, when Homer, in our very earliest writing, there's no mention of the color blue, and they don't really describe the sky as blue. They just describe it as the sky. When Homer describes the sea, he describes it as like a wine color.
Wine color.
Yeah, and then when the Egyptians started, I don't quote me on this because I would need to double check my sources, but the Egyptians may have been the first culture to recognize blue, and they even kind of talked about how primitive people couldn't see it in some sense.
That is fascinating to me.
Look
That
at. I remember reading this somewhere. I just have to find it again.
because we only have I'm gonna screw this up again, but like if you look at the eye, like on the back of the eye there are rods and cones, so all of the cones are really heavily concentrated in the fovea, and that's the point that most of the light, once it goes through your retina, is going to hit on the back of your eye, and it's usually right next to where the optic nerve is, where the blind spot goes out. The rest of it is rods, and rods have to do more so with being able to perceive movement and peripheral vision and grayscales. But that's the color perception portion of your eye. And I believe it's not red, yellow, green like you would anticipate it being.
Mm-hmm.
I'm pretty sure it's red, yellow, blue. So I'd have to look that up, though. It's been a while since I looked at what the cones were, that are the concentration of cones. So that is kind of interesting to me, because if we didn't previously have the ability to register blue on the color scale, like on the visual spectrum, and develop that later, oh my God, that I would love to read that. And thank you. Somebody said I'm gonna read more. I don't know if people send super chats. I'm doing awful. I'm the worst at the chat. Thank you, Wellington. Wellington said Shan is inspiring philosophy solipsist. And if anybody else sent a super chat, I'm gonna read them at the end when we get close. I'm really sorry. I promise I'll read them. I promise. Thank you. Thank you. I love you. Okay. So yeah. So are you a solipsist, Mike?
No. Solipsism is the idea that only I exist and you and everyone else is sort of an illusion of me. Idealists, we I've said before, I'm an objective idealist. So we do. I mean, every idealist recognizes there's other minds, other than of course solipsists specifically. But no, I would be an objective idealist. I do recognize there are other minds. There's an external mental world that I experience along with you, and then that's why we encounter the same mental substances or the same mental experiences. We experience the same thing. So yeah, I agree with you. We're navigating. I'm definitely not a solipsist. In fact, I even argued against solipsism in a video I did called "Cosmic Conscious Argument for God's Existence," because some people cite solipsism as an objection to that. So I did. I definitely am not. I think it might what you were just talking about with the color perception thing. It might be actually good to segue into that blind case study we were talking about.
That was really cool. Did you want to summarize it? If not, I can summarize it.
Go ahead. You
really,
go for
really
it.
interesting.
You go for it, because then I can add on something else after.
Okay, so you just sent this to me. Was it yesterday or the day before? I think I just finished it yesterday. It might have been the day before you sent it to me. So Mike sent me a case study about somebody who had dissociative identity disorder, which is colloquially referred to, and previously was in the DSM referred to, as multiple personality disorder. And what was fascinating about this case study, which they actually turned into a fairly controlled study, even though n equals 1 in this case, this person had multiple personalities and had a head trauma at one point, and had manifested as not as cerebrally blind, cortically blind. They still had some sort of visual acuity responses to pupil dilation, and they were still able to have nystagmus movements, which is essentially like involuntary movements for tracking, and they were myopic, which means nearsighted, but they weren't responsive to regular physical stimuli and weren't responsive to ocular stimuli in the same fashion. And they went through a gamut of tests and were essentially legally blind. Like, we're not seeing at all. They went into some sort of cognitive behavioral therapy, and the therapist that was working with them recognized that in some of the personalities that this person was manifesting, there was some degree of visual acuity that was different than others. Like, they were able to be slightly more reactive to light, for example, which is something that's an involuntary response. And he started to work with these personalities, and several of these personalities were able to develop sight, whereas others were not able to develop sight. And in order to test the theory, because people can fake it, they hooked them up to an EEG, and it used stimuli response to measure pupil dilation and also to measure neural activity during the same stimuli. And they called out personalities that either were or were not cited, and measured the acuity responses that this one individual female, that this person had to the light stimuli. And they could see both pupil dilation that was slightly higher, and also they could see the ocular cortex that's in the occipital lobe register a little bit better, as well as the singular geniculate nucleus, which is the relay system between the thalamus that takes all of your ocular, your visual information and kind of incorporates it into your perceived conceptual experience, registering on the EEG and on the fMRI. So this person had multiple personality. The crux of this is this person had multiple personality disorder, and some of them were blind and some of them weren't, and it was legit. And that's crazy.
Well, the interesting thing, the eyes were still receiving the light, and they were still receiving, but for some reason the brain was not registering it in one of his personalities. But when they switched back to one of the personalities that wasn't blind, the brain regions acted up again, and they could see. And it's just. But there's more. So there was a study, 1983, by B.G. Braun called Physio.
That's the same guy.
Yeah, I think it is. It was phenomenal. It was like a physiological phenomenon, multiple personalities and hypothesis. So I read that, and it brought me to a book called Irreducible Mind. And last night I read all of chapter 5, which is talking about some of this stuff. But the quote, I can quote directly from the book. He says, in this article, Braun also described 3 multiple personality cases of his own, which involve the appearance and disappearance depending on the personality, the multiple personality. So depending on the personality and control the body. Depending on the personality, allergies to citrus fruit, cigarette smoke, and cats would appear and go away when they did not, when they're different personality. He also described a case in which red dots resembling cigarette burns appeared on the skin, would appear depending on the personality that would be in charge of at that time. So depending on whatever personality was in charge, they could develop allergies. They could develop red marks, look like cigarette burns on their bodies, that they would associate with having, being burnt as a younger child, when they were a younger child, these types of things. So so basically, I think that all ties, but I'm going to tie all that back in now. That seems to relate to when idealists say that the brain is a physical representation of the person of itself. This one personality thought it was blind, and so the brain manifested in a way to correlate with that personality. These other people thought they had allergies, and the body manifested in a way to correlate with that type of thing. So I think this is, when I was reading that, it sounds very much fitting with sort of like an idealist paradigm, in that, the brain is sort of becoming the physical representation of the agent itself in that kind of sense. And I would wonder how you would think and respond to those types of things.
Okay, that's fascinating to me. The blindness one, I had a chance to think about a little bit more deeply than the ones that you just referenced, because I wasn't able to.
Sorry.
To study. Yeah, no, but I'd like to give some of my thoughts on them. So I'll start with the blindness one. So the blindness one, I found really, really fascinating. I can see why it registers as an issue, because it's essentially your consciousness having an effect on the physical, the way your brain physically operates. Now, it's less apparent in the one with the blindness, because as I referenced earlier, the lateral geniculate nucleus was involved, which is a component of the thalamus, and that interprets visual stimuli into your conscious awareness. So if there was some sort of head trauma, which there was in this case, that manifests multiple personalities, and you were creating pathways for that personality that existed in a neural network within the mind for that personality, and those pathways to a certain extent, or to a full extent, bypass the lateral geniculate nucleus, or the or somehow got lost before they were able to hit the hippocampus, or some other region of the brain that allows you to interpret that visual information. that causes that disparate experience, that you're able to receive that visual information but not assimilate it into your conscious recognition. That would make sense if it's those pathways being laid out that are affiliated with that personality being active in the brain, and those are the activation regions that are affiliated with that personality, and they bypass that lateral nucleus or bypass that part of the occipital lobe or bypass the hippocampus so that you can't become aware of that visual stimuli. That makes sense.
Yeah.
To a certain degree.
But
manifesting cigarette burns, I'd need to see the crap out of that study.
Yeah, I can.
And it's the same dude.
Yeah, it's interesting. Because he was focusing more on that. I drop it in the chat if you want the title of it. Wait, is that the right one?
Yeah.
No, that's the wrong one. My mistake.
No, okay.
This is there's. I was reading this book last night where this comes up, so I haven't even had time to check it. I just thought it was very interesting in relation to the blind one as well. But
the blind one was super cool, but I can see what you mean though, because what the multiple personality disorder in and of itself is both a help and a hindrance to your position, to my mind. And here's why I think both of those things. I think it's a help to your position because it's essentially saying that your consciousness is able to have an effect on the physical components of your brain. So that would be your brain manifesting consciousness, and then your consciousness subsequently affecting your brain. And then where does that start and end if you have multiple personalities? But by the same token, if you're a unique individual, being able to even have multiple personalities seems like it kind of defeats that argument, by fiat, right? Because which one of you is it? Like, yeah, what I mean?
But I wouldn't say so much that in multiple personality disorders, it's consciousness is divided. It's a personality has. So I would, again, the soul itself is just sort of split into, different segments. And then the conscious agent just doesn't remember which soul it actually is. And so this is what
everything about you could fundamentally change. You could have a complete paradigm shift.
I know.
Where your personality is just dramatically different. You don't even recognize yourself. You change your name. Like you could have some sort of head trauma that's like, you know what? Right now, my name is Brock, and I just want to punch people and get drunk and kick puppies. But that's still you, and you're
well, that's why I distinguish between the soul and the mind. And so, like a lot of therapy with people with DID is to sort of try to get them to emerge these personalities into one in some sort of sense. So yeah, I would expect, and as I said, the soul is malleable. I would expect it to be able to be divided and then eventually hopefully conquered and reassembled in that kind of sense.
Right.
So yeah, exactly. Under idealism, I would expect the soul to be malleable in so many ways that we would expect it to be that kind of sense. Then on the flip side, if the soul is divided, depending on which part of the personality is in control, the brain would sort of manifest in that kind of same sort of way, because that's the physical representation of the agent itself sort of manifesting in the physical world. So yeah, that's exactly what I would expect. And this is why I think that this is why I wanted to define my term so much in the beginning, because I think that's very important.
No, that does make sense. But what's the essence of you then? Like, is there an essence of you?
Yes and no. There is, but it's so.
Damn you and your yes and no's, Mike.
The universe is always stranger than we think. Every 10 years, it's every 10 years it gets stranger. But yeah, there isn't. But just think about you in your body. Just think, if you're just a body, where is the distinguishing line between you and the environment? It's quite blurred. The oxygen I'm breathing now, is that part of me? What about the water I'm drinking? What about when I have to go to the bathroom? Is that I'm losing part of me? What about when I scratch skin cells off? You get a new body every 7 years. The reality is between your body and the environment, it's quite blurred. And I would say that's kind of how it is in general with idealism as well. This is why I used the whirlpool analogy in the beginning. You can see a whirlpool, but it's hard to really distinguish that between the whole entire river itself. There is clearly a distinction, but it's quite a blurred distinction. So yeah, there is an essence of you, but it is blurred in some sense. So I would say, yeah, there is an essence of you, but it's kind of blurred. If materialism is true, we're all one in a sense, because we're all matter. We're just discrete individuals having different individual lives experiences, but we're all one. Idealism is kind of the same way, but in reverse. Yeah, we all are one in this. I hate sounding like a new ager, but I have to say it to get the kind of idea
We're
across.
all one.
Yeah.
The wind chimes.
we're all one in some sense, but we're also uniquely distinct in certain ways. So yeah, it's really hard to say. It's really hard to make the black and white distinction. It's quite blurred, and regardless of what paradigm you're looking at it from.
Okay, it's all fascinating. I want to be respectful of your time, and we're almost at an hour and a half. So I know that there was at least 2 super chat questions, and I want to make sure that I'm respectful of the people that were kind enough to donate. So I'm going to read those if that's okay with you.
Yeah,
and if anybody.
That's fine. I got to get going in probably about 10 or 15 minutes. I promised my daughter I'd take her for a walk, so I have to do that, or else I'll be in trouble.
You do.
I'll be in trouble.
Yeah, you will. With me and her if you don't do that. All right. So the first is Joe, the graphics guy. Thank you, Joe. And Joe said, I'm a religion expert, and I know with confidence that the soul lives in the pancreas. Damage the pancreas equals damage the soul. Tell Mike he's wrong.
That's the example I gave before we went on air, is that someone once told me that the brain creates consciousness the same way that the kidney creates urine. Yeah, and I was like, okay, well, yeah.
Yeah, you did.
Maybe the soul is,
it's in the pancreas.
Yeah.
And you're wrong. That was my favorite part.
That's fine.
You're wrong. No, I'm just kidding. All right. And Vibrantly Brantley, because I already read yours, Wellington. Thank you. I already asked if he was a solipsist. I don't know how much beer costs up there in Canada land, but figured you'll want one after this. Thanks, Chris. I appreciate it. Thank you to you guys who sent super chats. I appreciate supporting the channel.
You still have your rum, though.
I do, yeah. I'm not very good at the drinking it this evening. This has nothing to do with what we're about to talk about. St. Patrick's Day was this weekend, and I decided I was going to drink whiskey because my name is Shannon and my middle name's Colleen, and I'm very Irish. I'm not going to tell you my last name, but it does start with Q, and it's also very Irish. So I decided I was going to drink some whiskey for the first time in a really long time. And I also decided that meant that I wanted to talk to somebody who thought the earth was flat. And I woke up with a headache. Yeah, right? I woke up with a headache, and I'm not even sure what caused it. Whether it was the whiskey or the conversation with.
It wasn't the whiskey.
It wasn't the whiskey. You're right. It was good whiskey. It was apple whiskey. It was Crown Royal apple whiskey, and it was delightful. I had it with Sprite. But yeah, so I'm being calm because I made an error in judgment, and I don't want to repeat the same mistake twice. So that's my story. Good story, everybody. So yeah, on that note, please go take your daughter for a walk. Thank you so much. For anybody who tuned in late that isn't familiar with you, which is probably nobody, because everybody knows that you're just a lovely gentleman, and they probably are already familiar with your channel, but please tell them where to find you, and if they don't hear you, they can click on the link in the description down below.
Yeah, I'm inspiring philosophy. So I'm a Christian apologist, but I'm also an idealist. So a lot of Christian apologists don't like me because of that. But I'm exploring a lot of these ideas. I'm exploring different things with simulation theory. I'm actually going to be I'm going to be going in a completely different direction this summer. I'm going to be doing a whole series on Genesis and sort of explaining it in its ancient Near Eastern context. So I'm going to be going over how I don't think Genesis 1:1 is even translated correctly. I don't think "in the beginning" should be in the verse. I'm going to go over. Yeah, I'm going to go over.
You're going to make so many people mad.
I'm going to argue also there was death in the Garden of Eden. I'm going to argue that Eve wasn't made from a rib. I'm going to argue what it means to be made from dust. It has nothing to do with material creation. I'm going to argue that the Genesis serpent wasn't a talking snake, but was some type of snake. It's going to be complicated, but I'll get there. I'm going to argue the tree of knowledge. I'm going to argue the tree of knowledge of good and evil wasn't bad. It wasn't meant to not be eaten from. We've been and I'm going to argue from scholars like John Walton, Michael Heiser, J. Richard Middleton. So I'm going to be doing a whole series on opening lines of Genesis and going through a lot of complicated issues.
I can't wait for Twitter the day that those start coming out.
Oh, yeah. It's going to be fun.
Amped about that. please let me know so that I can get popcorn and a glass of rum and just sit in front of my computer and watch what happens on Twitter.
But here's the thing,
great.
I might lose subscribers, I might lose supporters over it, but I'm more interested in truth. I'm more interested in trying to understand these ideas in their ancient Near Eastern context. And again, as I said before we got on air, but if it turns out we can show how the brain creates consciousness, I have no idea, or I have no problem trying to convert to that and trying to accept that idea, because I want to try to get my biases down as low as humanly possible. It's hard to do. I mean, I fight with it all the time, but I hope we all can do that. And that's why I'm really happy we can have conversations like this, because, you know, Steve McRae has been a big inspiration to me for fighting tribal.
Don't say that. God damn it. No, we don't encourage Steve on this channel, Mike. That's
I will.
rule.
to be fair, he's good at fighting tribalism, and I want to try to do the same. And I think these kind of conversations are good because we shouldn't be against each other. We should be trying to work together and to explore different ideas and give different perspectives. So I would encourage all my subscribers as well that are listening to this right now to subscribe to your channel as well.
Oh, thank you. I appreciate that. And yeah, vice versa. I think there's so much partisanism, and we've divided for whatever reason off into factions that are we see each other as enemies instead of, you know, humans who are coexisting and attempting to find truth. And the art of just being able to have a conversation about what you disagree with, and, you know, find each other's personalities interesting and want to have, you know, real legitimate dialogue and seek truth, and like you said, kind of reduce biases and challenge yourself, seems to be lost. Everybody's just really interested in telling everybody why they're right, and nobody's open to being wrong, and, you know, or just exploring why they even think the way they do. So I very much appreciate you coming here to talk to me today, and, you know, helping bridge part of that gap. It's awesome.
Yeah.
I mean, even if you're wrong.
Oh yeah, I'm obviously wrong. Obviously.
I mean, even if you're obviously, I'm gonna put that on a soundboard.
Yeah. I mean, you're obviously wrong, but thanks for coming on. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, totally. No, actually, there's a lot to think about. I'm gonna have to listen to this again, I think, because this was pretty dense. We're both incredibly clever. Everybody's incredibly lucky to be able to listen to the two of us.
They sure are. So,
right?
Yeah. Well, I mean, consciousness is a complicated issue, and if anyone says I've got it all solved, they're lying. This is really a complicated issue, and it's Daniel Dennett says it's one of the greatest mysteries out there, and I agree. It is. It's a deep subject to dive into, and yet it's just right in our face. We can't get away from it. It's just what we are, conscious.
Yeah, or right behind our face if you're me.
Yeah.
All right, I'll let you go have a walk with your daughter. So thank you, everybody. I appreciate it. Go subscribe to Mike's channel, and if you're new here, subscribe to this channel too, and, you know, be a patroner. I'm the worst YouTuber in the world, so it's like, if you like me, subscribe. Have a good night. Bye, guys.